This video shows some helpful hints about setting up the Panasonic GH2. It will cover basic settings, the intelligent dynamic range feature, and color settings. If you like this video and would like to see more videos like it, then subscribe to my channel. If you have other settings you would like to recommend, then please post a comment below. First, I would like to go over the custom settings feature labeled C1, C2, and C3. Using the custom settings will allow you to store your favorite settings and quickly switch back and forth between them. I store all of my settings that are geared towards still images in the C1 setting. In this mode, I use shutter priority because shutter speed is the most critical aspect for indoor low-light pictures and videos I usually take. The GH2 has a multi-aspect ratio sensor that does not crop any of the aspect ratios. However, most of the time I like the image to fill the LCD screen, so my default aspect ratio is 3:2. I stored the settings with aspect ratio highlighted, so it is the first setting that is shown when I click the quick menu button. Next is the still image format setting. By default, I've stored it on the highest quality JPEG setting. That is because most of the time I upload my pictures directly to Facebook with an iFi card. When I'm doing this, I am not as concerned about image quality as I am about sharing the images as fast as possible. If your number one priority is image quality and you intend to do any editing at all, you should use the RAW format setting. The next setting I want to discuss is the intelligent dynamic range feature called I.Dynamic. You can turn this feature on by adjusting the icon with the upside down exclamation point and the circle. The setting is affecting the image only when it is yellow. The issue with this setting is that it rarely turns yellow, and when it does, the effect is barely noticeable. You can see that it barely brightens the shadows when I switch it on. However, there is a trick to getting this setting to operate at its full potential. The camera must detect severely underexposed areas of the image, and the image must have a large dynamic range between the darkest and brightest area. If you underexpose the image, the setting will trigger more often and show a greater effect. If you overexpose the image, then it won't produce any effect at all because it does not affect the highlights of the image. Most people think that this setting will trigger just because there are dark areas in the image. It actually needs very dark and very bright areas at the same time. It is rare for that to occur indoors. You really need sunlight for this setting to be effective. It will work for both stills and for video. However, it increases the level of noise in the shadows more for video than it does for stills. It never has any effect on the highlights at all. Now I'm going to quickly run through these next settings because it is a matter of preference how you use them. If you want to see what settings I use, you can just pause the video while I quickly show them. I typically use the high-speed burst mode for action shots. However, this mode does not give you a live view of the images between shots. Therefore, it can be extremely hard to track a moving image. If this is an issue for you, the medium burst rate mode will give you almost the same burst rate and it has live view. I have programmed my Function 2 button to control the extra teleconversion feature while in JPEG mode. I often shoot video and stills in this mode, so it makes it easy to switch it on and off. However, the ETC mode will be disabled if you switch to shooting raw images. If you shoot raw images only, then you might want to program a different function into this button instead. I typically shoot with Auto ISO because trying to change to specific ISO is too slow. I don't have a problem with shooting up to ISO 3200 even in JPEG mode, so I'm okay with letting the camera control the ISO. I typically shoot pictures in the nature color mode because I feel it gives the most natural colors while still maintaining a good dynamic range. Some people prefer the smooth mode because it boosts the shadows. However, it also blows out the highlights, so I don't typically use it. In addition, smooth mode will also meter the light 1/3 of a stop darker than the other modes. This will even affect raw images because it will select a faster shutter speed than the other modes will without altering any of the other settings. It can be easily adjusted for in post-processing with raw images. However, it can cause issues if you set up your raw workflow based on the metering from one of the other color modes. I turn contrast down to -2, sharpness to 0, color to 0, and noise reduction to -2. You will need to experiment with these settings to see what suits your tastes. However, I always turn noise reduction to -2. The noise reduction setting even affects raw images, and it is a very poor implementation of noise reduction. I set up my default auto white balance settings so that it is 2 stops towards amber and 3 stops towards magenta. This is purely a matter of preference, so you need to experiment with what settings work best for you. I set up my function 2 button so that it controls the flash adjustment while in C1 mode. You can adjust the autofocus area by touching the screen and dragging the slider. If you hit the trash can button, it will automatically center the box. The upcoming firmware in December will allow you to set the focus using the entire screen instead of just a portion of it. I am going to quickly go through the menu settings without much explanation. If you have specific questions, then ask them in the comments and I will respond to them and include more detail in future videos. The My Menu screen is a great way to quickly access often used functions. This list stores the last 5 functions that you have used. I don't recommend using the Intelligent Auto mode because it really isn't that intelligent. However, this is the setup I would use if I had to. The program priority mode is good if you want the camera to control almost everything, but you don't want to be forced into using the intelligent ISO setting that the I.Auto mode uses. The biggest problem with the program priority mode is that it will not use a fast enough shutter speed indoors for moving subjects like kids and pets. I wish you could set a minimum shutter speed for this mode like other manufacturers allow you to do. Note that the shutter speed never changes from 1/60th of a second while in this mode. Aperture priority mode is good if you really need control over aperture. However, it also has the same issue where it doesn't use a fast enough shutter speed indoors. In manual mode, I turn the constant preview setting on. This will always show me an accurate representation of the exposure that I've selected. This setting also prevents the shutter speed from changing for the live view. Turning this setting on is essential for timing shots with the live view screen, especially indoors. If you turn this setting off, then the shutter speed of the live view will vary and it will always show you an image with the correct exposure and not the exposure you have selected. Now I'm going to show you my settings for the C2 mode, which I use to shoot 1080p at 24 frames per second video. This mode is suitable for professional quality video. I have my camera hacked to 42 megabits per second in this mode, which is plenty to completely eliminate all compression artifacts. The hack settings I use are completely stable for all memory cards. You can find a link to those settings in the video's description. I use the Cinema Color mode for videos because, contrary to popular belief, it is actually the best color mode for editing. It doesn't boost the shadows and highlights like the smooth and nostalgic modes do, so I can independently adjust them in post-processing. Please note that the cinema mode produces an image that is most like the raw image that is captured. That image is underexposed, so you would need to apply some exposure gain in post-processing. I usually increase the shadows by 2/3 of a stop to compensate for this. My C3 mode is set up in similar fashion to my C2 mode, except for it shoots 720p at 60 frames per second video instead of 1080p at 24 frames per second video. I never use the 1080i because it produces interlaced artifacts that look terrible unless you set the shutter speed to less than 1/60th of a second. The firmware update in December is rumored to add a 1080p at 30 frames per second true progressive mode. That would be ideal for most of the videos I shoot. For the 720p at 60 frames per second mode, you should use 1/20th of a second shutter speed instead of 1/50th of a second shutter speed from the 1080p at 24 frames per second mode. I typically use the manual movie mode for slowed down and sped up video. I carry my camera and lenses in this small camera bag that I got from Wolf Camera for about $40. There's a link for it in this video's description. I love that it can hold the GH2 and the 14-140mm lens, the Olympus 45mm f1.8, the Leica 25mm f1.4, the 45mm to 200mm, the 14mm f2.5, the 20mm f1.7, an extra battery, an extra memory card, and oh yeah, another extra battery. Here's a demonstration of how fast you can take the camera out of the bag, change the lens, and take a picture. And finally, here are a couple of videos of some fun things I've recorded with the camera.